There are truths so unbearable that whole towns agree never to speak them, secrets not erased but carefully buried, like toxic waste beneath the soil, poisoning everything it touches for generations. What if I told you that one such truth surfaced in the isolated ridges of West Virginia, a place where silence was stronger than law, where fear was thicker than blood? The case I'm about to lay before you is one of those rare horrors where fact feels more grotesque than fiction. A story of a man who didn't just destroy his family, he turned family itself into something unrecognizable. This is the story of Thomas Blackwood and the 7 daughters who became his prisoners, his victims, and most disturbingly, his partners in the forced continuation of his bloodline. By the time state officials finally dared approach the Blackwood property in 1946, the damage had already metastasized. Generations of incest, isolation, and forced births had warped the very fabric of kinship within those hills. Daughters were mothers, sisters were cousins, fathers were brothers, and beneath the crumbling roof of the Blackwood farmhouse, the cries of children born into silence echoed through the decades. But to understand how it all began, we need to rewind more than half a century, to a moment when a single purchase changed the fate of an entire family. The arrival of the Blackwoods. The first mention of the Blackwoods enters the record in 1893. A man in his late 40s, identified as Thomas Blackwood, appeared at the county clerk's office with a satchel full of cash. He purchased nearly 500 acres of untouched forest land in the remote hills north of Westland. His signature on the deed is smooth, assured. Beside it sits the crude ex of his wife, Martha, who, by all surviving accounts, was meek and voiceless. Clerk Harold Jennings, a meticulous man who kept private notes, described the encounter in a margin scroll never meant for public eyes. The man's stare was uncomfortably steady, as though measuring me against some scripture only he knew. The daughters, 7 of them, never once raised their eyes. Not one spoke. The 7 daughters, ranging from 4 to 16 years old, accompanied their parents to this new life of supposed self-sufficiency. 2 neighbors. The family appeared merely eccentric, a little too reclusive perhaps, but hardly alarming. After all, in the years following the Civil War, many families fled industrial towns, retreating into wilderness in search of independence and safety. The Blackwoods seemed just another branch in this larger movement. But even then, whispers began. Building without witness, within months, a sprawling farmhouse emerged on the cleared land. 2 stories tall, with barns and smokehouses, its scale dwarfed that of neighboring homesteads. Yet no laborers were ever hired. No local men reported helping with the construction. Supply records from the Westland General Store confirmed the purchase of stoves, lumber, panes of glass, but not one wagoner, not one carpenter, admitted hauling the loads up the steep, narrow roads. So how did Thomas Blackwood manage it alone? Or was alone just another illusion carefully cultivated? The mystery thickened as the years passed. The daughters were never seen outside the property. Only Thomas ventured into town, purchasing supplies and retrieving newspapers. He never allowed conversation beyond necessity, and his eyes, locals remembered, carried the intensity of a zealot. Then came the first troubling report, the mail carrier's account. Elijah Crawford's father, the county's mail carrier in the 1890s, kept a detailed journal of his daily routes. In an 1897 entry, he noted a disturbing incident. Delivered a package to Blackwood. Heard crying from the barn. Too sharp, too human to be livestock. Asked, he said it was a calf, but I know better. It was a single sentence in a log, otherwise filled with mundane details of weather and deliveries. But that line marks one of the earliest cracks in the Blackwood facade. What was truly happening inside the barn that day? The first medical record, the first undeniable proof of horror, emerged in January 1898, when county physician Dr. Samuel Porter was summoned to the property. His ledger records a case of a difficult birth, but his private journal tells a far darker story. The patient was no wife at all, but a girl of no more than 13. The father insisted on discretion, forbidding the mention of paternity, yet the resemblance to the man who summoned me was unmistakable. She did not cry out once, as though trained by fear to silence herself. The infant was stillborn. Porter's words stand as the earliest documentation of what would become the Blackwood family's defining horror: incestuous reproduction, enforced by the father. Imagine for a moment being that physician, bound by professional ethics, terrified of reprisal, staring into the face of a child mother and knowing the truth that no one else would acknowledge. And I'll ask you this because it's a question history demands we confront. If you were in Porter's shoes, would you have defied Thomas Blackwood, risked your own safety to raise the alarm? Or would you, like Porter, record your horror in private notes and allow the silence to continue? Comment your answer below. Silence and fear. Porter treated the girl, accepted payment in cash, and left the property. In the years that followed, his journals record at least 3 more such visits, each involving a different daughter, each with pregnancies unacknowledged by official records. None of the births were registered, none of the infant's paternity listed. The secrecy was airtight. Porter's frustration bleeds through his writings. This is not mere incest. It is a colony unto itself, a man replicating his blood until no distinction between father and child, brother and sister remains. The law will not act, the community whispers. But no one dares intervene. The weight of his helplessness, preserved in those lines, is suffocating. The community's complicity by the 1910s, townsfolk no longer spoke openly of the Blackwoods. Their property became a place of superstition, avoided at all costs. Farmers near the ridge complained of hearing strange wails on still nights. A woman fetching water swore she saw pale figures moving through the fields at dawn, heads bowed, never looking skyward. But no complaint ever reached the sheriff's desk. No petition ever forced an investigation. The Blackwoods were left alone, guarded by silence as effective as any law. Why? Some say it was feared that Thomas Blackwood carried the aura of a man not to be crossed. Others say it was shame, that to acknowledge the horror would be to implicate themselves for allowing it. Whatever the reason, silence became complicity. And once again, I put the question to you, what would you have done? In a time when lawmen were scarce, when your nearest neighbor lived miles away, would you have walked up that mountain to confront the patriarch? Or would you, too, have turned away, praying the cries you heard were only livestock? Census shadows by the 1920 census. Cracks in the silence appeared again. Government agents tasked with documenting the county population described unusually large households in the Blackwood region. 6 children, no father listed. Mothers vaguely marked as housekeepers. Every surname Blackwood. The confusion of generational lines was evident even then. A child could be a daughter, or a granddaughter, or both. Sisters were mothers, mothers were daughters. The web of relations tangled beyond recognition. Still, no official action followed. The march toward 1946 for more than 5 decades, the Blackwood cycle continued. Daughters gave birth. Those children grew into mothers themselves, producing another generation under the same roof. The farmhouse, once new and proud, sagged under the weight of too many bodies, too many secrets. Neighbors spoke of disease spreading in the hills, whispered of strange deformities in some of the children. Yet still, no one intervened. The silence had grown too heavy to break, and it was not until the summer of 1946, when State Health Inspector Franklin Moore forced his way onto the property, that the true scale of the Blackwood horror came to light. His report would contain the line that encapsulates everything. 7 daughters, all mothers. 7 daughters, all sharing one father. But what Moore found inside the farmhouse, the journals, the photographs, the remains would shake even hardened officials. That, however, is a revelation we will reserve for part 2. What's your take? If you were a neighbor of the Blackwoods, hearing the whispers, seeing the signs, would you have risked everything to stop Thomas? Or would the fear of isolation and reprisal have silenced you? 2. Drop your thoughts in the comments. The Blackwood name had become a ghost story by the mid-20th century. Accursed whispered in bars, as shadow children dared each other to shout into the woods. For more than 50 years, their isolated property bred not only new generations but also myths, suspicions, and fear so deep it hardened into silence. But silence is fragile. And in the late summer of 1946, it finally cracked. The health inspector's mission. Franklin Moore wasn't looking for horror. He was a state health inspector, dispatched after reports of rampant sickness spreading through the northern ridges of Westland County. Local farmers whispered of wasting disease, of children dying young, of families too proud or too afraid to call for help. Moore's job was straightforward: track the source of contagion. But his journey up the mountain brought him to the long-feared Blackwood property, a place neighbors described as tainted ground. His official report begins, plainly enough, arrived at Blackwood residence. September 14, 1946. Large farmhouse, weathered in disrepair. Numerous outbuildings collapsed or unused. Odor of rot strong upon approach. But from there, his language falters, and the tone shifts from clinical to horrified. First impressions of the farmhouse, the Blackwood farmhouse, once a symbol of stubborn independence, had become a ruin. Roof beams sagged, paint peeled away, and windows gaped like the eyes of a corpse. Chickens ran wild in the yard. A half-broken wagon leaned against the barn, its wheels long rotted. What disturbed Moore most, however, wasn't the decay, it was the silence. He wrote, "The woods here are still, unnaturally so. No birdsong. Even the wind carries a weight, as though sighing through the trees. The air is thick, oppressive, as if charged with memory itself." And then the figures appeared. The pale shadows, from the edge of the yard. Moore saw them, thin rail-like bodies moving silently in the dawn mist. They did not look up. They did not speak. Children perhaps, or young adults, barefoot and pale, carrying buckets between house and barn. Their movements were jerky, mechanical, more like shadows than living beings, Moore wrote. The children avoided my gaze, not out of shyness but as though eye contact itself was forbidden. Their faces resembled one another so closely that distinguishing siblings from cousins, sons from daughters, was impossible. They moved with an air of practiced invisibility. It was his first living glimpse of the Blackwood colony, and the image never left him. Meeting the patriarch at the farmhouse door, Franklin Moore was greeted not by a man but by a matriarchal figure, an elderly woman, stooped and She identified herself only as Martha, though more doubted she was the original wife of Thomas Blackwood. She smelled of sickness and spoke little, her words slurred by age and disuse. It was not Thomas then, but his shadow, his rules, his legacy that more confronted the original patriarch, records suggest, had died years earlier, but his system lived on, maintained by the daughters he had turned into mothers, and by their children who bore his blood. Moore described the atmosphere inside the house as suffocating. Every surface reeks of mold and sweat. The walls are covered in crude repairs, patched with boards and rags. Children sit in corners, silent, their faces expressionless. There is no laughter, no chatter, no human noise save for shallow breathing. The journals, it was in a locked trunk, pried open during Moore's inspection, that the true horror began to crystallize. Inside were journals, dozens of them written in a heavy, uneven hand. The earliest bore the name T. Blackwood. Later volumes carried no name at all, only the continuation of his words. The journals detailed not just daily life, but doctrine. Thomas Blackwood had convinced himself that he was fulfilling a divine mission, to preserve and strengthen his bloodline by keeping it untainted by outsiders. He wrote of God's design, of blood made pure through itself, of daughters as vessels chosen by providence. Passages grew increasingly delusional. The world outside rots in sin. We are the ark. My seed is the covenant. To let another man touch what is mine would be to break the circle ordained by heaven. But most chilling were the family records, lists of names, births, and deaths. Generations of children were recorded not by father but by line. Sons and daughters marked as branch A, branch B, their parentage folding back into itself like a closed loop. Moore underlined one line in red ink: 7 daughters, all mothers, 7 daughters, all sharing one father. The photographs alongside the journals were photographs sepia-toned, taken with an old camera. They showed the daughters at various ages, always stiff, unsmiling, their gazes downcast. In some images, their swollen bellies were visible beneath plain dresses. Later, photos captured groups of children, eerily uniform in appearance, arranged like livestock for documentation. Their faces were blurred not by motion but by malnourishment, sunken eyes too large for their skulls. Moore wrote in his report, "These are not family portraits, these are records of breeding. And I'll ask you directly, because this is the moment where imagination and reality collide. How would you have reacted? Standing in that dim farmhouse, leafing through pages that proved an entire family had been twisted into a closed system of flesh. Would you have felt horror, pity, rage? Comment below, because the moral weight of this discovery is not just historical. It asks something of all of us. The remains. The most disturbing discovery lay beneath the barn, a pit shallowly covered with dirt and straw. Moore's report describes it with restrained horror. Multiple remains exhumed: infants, small children, cause of death uncertain in many cases. Signs of neglect, malnutrition, and disease evident. No markers, no ceremony. For decades, locals had whispered of crying in the barn. Now the truth was undeniable. The barn had been not only a place of labor but also a burial ground for the countless stillbirths, sickly infants, and unwanted children of the Blackwood bloodline. The silence of the farm was revealed for what it truly was: the hush of death. The breaking point: Moore's findings could not be buried. His report, though suppressed for years, leaked through whispers and photocopies. Officials who read it described nausea, disbelief, and shame. How could such a thing have persisted for more than half a century, in plain sight, while an entire county looked away? Law enforcement finally intervened, but by then, the damage was irreversible. The Blackwood descendants, numbering dozens, were scattered into state custody. Many were too sick to survive. Others, confused by the outside world, struggled to adapt. Their lineage, once tightly wound around itself, began to unravel. But the stain remained. Community reaction in the weeks following the inspection. Locals flocked to county bars and church pews, their whispers louder now, but no less cowardly. Some claimed they had always suspected, others swore they had heard nothing. A few confessed they had deliberately ignored the signs, believing it was not their place to interfere in another man's household. Moore, bitter and exhausted, wrote in his private notes, "The silence was not born from ignorance but complicity. A whole community chose not to see because seeing would demand action, and so I put the same challenge to you. What do you think? Is a community responsible when it allows horror to fester in its midst? Or do you believe the blame rests solely on the shoulders of Thomas Blackwood and his brood?" Leave your thoughts in the comments, because silence itself is a choice, then and now. The aftermath. What became of the Blackwood family after 1946 is a story tangled in secrecy and shame. Official records show that many children were placed in state institutions. Some died young from congenital illnesses. A handful grew to adulthood, their names changed, their pasts hidden, but others simply disappeared. Files misplaced, cases untracked. Even today, genealogists whisper of Blackwood bloodlines hiding in plain sight, descendants who know nothing of their origins. And the farmhouse, it was abandoned, left to rot into the earth. Locals avoided it, claiming the land itself was cursed. Hunters swore the woods around it carried no birdsong. One man claimed to hear crying on the wind whenever he passed too close. The Blackwood farmhouse became a scar in the landscape, a physical reminder of what silence allows. Closing reflections on Part 2. Franklin Moore's 1946 inspection pulled the Blackwoods out of whispers and into history. His words forced the community and, eventually the nation, to acknowledge what had been festering for more than half a century. But the Blackwoods are not just a story of horror. They are a mirror, reflecting uncomfortable truths about human silence, complicity, and the ways shame can paralyze action. Because ask yourself, how many other Blackwoods have existed in hidden corners, protected not by remoteness but by the unwillingness of neighbors to interfere? How many cries have been dismissed as just a calf in the barn? That's the haunting question we must carry forward as we move to Part 3. What would you have done in Franklin Moore's place? Would you have entered that farmhouse, opened that trunk, lifted that barn floor? Or would you have turned back, convincing yourself the sickness in the hills was someone else's burden? Share your thoughts below. When Franklin Moore descended the mountain in 1946, he carried with him more than notes and photographs. He carried proof that the whispers were true, that the Blackwood farmhouse was not just a place of poverty and secrecy, but of generational horror. But exposing a truth is only the beginning. What comes after the reckoning? The denial, the attempt to make sense of the unspeakable that is often more telling than the horror itself. The Blackwoods may have lived in isolation, but their crimes were not theirs alone. They were enabled by silence, by neighbors who looked away, by officials who filed away suspicious records and never pursued them. And when the silence finally broke, what spilled out could never be put back. The investigation widens. Moore's report forced law enforcement into action. Sheriff's deputies, who for decades had avoided setting foot on Blackwood land, now found themselves tasked with investigating what had been allowed to fester for half a century. Their official language was stiff, but their unease was clear. One deputy described the farmhouse as a place where the air itself felt wrong. Inside, investigators catalogued the journals, the photographs, and the skeletal remains from the barn pit. Each artifact was another nail in the coffin of communal denial. Dozens of children and young adults were removed from the property and placed in state custody. Some were visibly ill, their bodies ravaged by malnutrition and genetic disorders. Others appeared disturbingly detached, staring blankly at officials, unable to answer questions. One social worker wrote, "These are not children in the usual sense. They have been raised like shadows, without language, without laughter, courtrooms and sealed files." You might expect the case to explode into headlines, to become a national scandal, but that isn't what happened. Instead, the investigation stumbled into silence once again, this time, a silence imposed from above. County officials feared the scandal would destroy the region's reputation, driving away industry and investment. Judges sealed most of the records. Local newspapers published only vague references to unfit conditions and state custody cases. The most damning documents, the journals, the photographs, Moore's detailed notes, were locked away in archives, restricted from public access. For decades, the Blackwood case became less a matter of record than of rumor, passed in half-whispered stories over bar counters and kitchen tables. This raises a question I want you to consider. Was the decision to seal the files an act of mercy, shielding surviving children from public shame? Or was it another layer of complicity, protecting reputations at the cost of truth? Comment your thoughts, because even today, communities wrestle with whether truth should be buried for the greater good. Survivors in the shadows. What happened to the Blackwood children removed from the farmhouse is a story fragmented by missing files and bureaucratic neglect. We know some were placed in state orphanages, institutions already stretched thin in the aftermath of World War II. Others were fostered out under new names, their pasts deliberately erased. Social workers described difficulty integrating them. Many were socially withdrawn, prone to silence, or deeply distrustful of outsiders. Some spoke only in hushed tones, as though fearful their words might summon punishment. Others carried visible signs of deformity: crooked spines, fused fingers, clouded eyes that marked them as different and often condemned them to lives of further isolation. At least a handful of Blackwood descendants grew into adulthood, marrying, working, blending into communities under new identities. Their children, and their children's children, may live today, unaware of the bloodline that binds them to the farmhouse on the hill. But others didn't survive. State records mention unexplained deaths in institutions, children who failed to thrive. Some simply disappeared from paperwork, lost in the shuffle of case numbers and name changes. And so the Blackwoods continued, not as a family confined to one farmhouse, but as a ghost lineage scattered into society. The community reckons for the townsfolk of Westland. The exposure of the Blackwoods was a mirror they did not want to face. Many claimed ignorance we never knew, others minimized their responsibility. It wasn't our place, but a few admitted years later that the silence had been intentional. One farmer recalled, "Everyone knew something wasn't right up there, but he was a hard man, that Thomas people didn't want to cross him. Easier to stay away, pretend it wasn't happening." In churches, sermons were delivered on sin and secrecy. In bars, men shook their heads, muttering that it was God's punishment. But no one could quite shake the unease, the recognition that their collective silence had allowed the Blackwood cycle to persist for decades. So I ask you now, do you believe the community bears responsibility? Should the neighbors, the mail carriers, the clerks, the doctors who stayed silent be judged alongside Thomas Blackwood? Or was their fear understandable in a time and place where isolation meant survival? Leave your answer in the comments. The curse of the land, the farmhouse itself, became a symbol of dread. After the family was dispersed, no one purchased the property. The barns rotted into the earth. The fields grew wild with weeds and thorn. Hunters avoided the area, claiming the woods carried no birdsong. Children dared each other to run up the dirt road but refused to linger after dark. Locals swore the land was cursed. Some claimed to hear cries carried on the wind. Others reported seeing pale figures at the windows, though the house was long abandoned. One sheriff's deputy who had been part of the raid never returned to the property, telling friends, "That place isn't empty. It's waiting." In this way, the Blackwoods became less a family and more a legend, their story haunting the land itself. A story too disturbing to tell. By the 1950s, the case was nearly forgotten, buried under sealed records and fading memories. The few who spoke of it described it as too disturbing to repeat aloud. Teachers left it out of local history. Preachers avoided naming it from the pulpit. The silence had returned, not out of fear this time, but out of shame. And yet, whispers persisted. Travelers passing through Westland were sometimes told not to venture north into the hills. Old men in bars leaned close to share fragments. The father who made mothers of his daughters. The family that forgot where blood ended. But official history erased the Blackwoods. They survived only in rumor, in the haunted hush that lingers when a community agrees to bury its past. The weight of memory. Franklin Moore never quite recovered from what he saw. In letters to colleagues, he admitted nightmares of pale children and silent daughters. He wrote bitterly that his report had been buried like the bodies under the barn. He lived the rest of his life as a quiet man, rarely speaking of the Blackwoods again. But his surviving notes, discovered years later in a university archive, reignited interest in the case. Without his words, the Blackwoods might have dissolved entirely into myth. And this is where I want to pause and ask you, do you believe some stories are too dark to preserve? Should the Blackwood files have remained sealed, protecting future generations from the weight of this history? Or is remembering even the most horrifying truths necessary to ensure silence never wins again? Share your thoughts, because this question reaches far beyond the Blackwoods. The long shadow today. The Blackwood story survives in fragments. Rumors pass between locals, a handful of scholars piecing together scattered documents, internet forums, trading tales of the incest colony in the hills, but the shadow remains. In the hills of West Virginia, silence still lingers in the trees. The farmhouse, though collapsed, is said to be a place where compasses fail, where the wind carries sighs, where even animals avoid the ground. Whether you see the Blackwoods as a cautionary tale of silence, a grotesque footnote in American history, or a lingering curse depends on how you interpret what remains. But one truth is inescapable. The horror was real. It lived in those hills, and its memory asks something of us even now. Closing reflections on Part 3. The Blackwood case teaches us that horror does not thrive in isolation alone. It thrives in silence. It thrives when communities decide that looking away is easier than confronting the truth. For 50 years, the Blackwoods were hidden in plain sight, their cries muffled by trees and shame. And when the silence was finally broken, it revealed a truth so disturbing that officials once again chose to bury it. But buried truths do not vanish. They seep, they linger, they stain. And as we move into Part 4, we'll explore the afterlife of the Blackwood story, the legends, the modern investigations, and the uneasy question of whether their bloodline still walks among us. What do you think? Was it right for officials to seal the Blackwood files, sparing survivors the shame but keeping the truth hidden? Or did that act of suppression simply continue the cycle of silence that allowed the horror in the first place? Drop your answer in the comments. The Blackwood farmhouse no longer stands. Time and weather reclaimed it, collapsing beams into the earth, swallowing the walls with vines. To the casual hiker, the spot is just another clearing in the West Virginia hills. But for those who know the story, the land still breathes unease, because some places are not just dirt and trees, they are wounds. Myths that outlived the house even after the farmhouse rotted away. The Blackwoods refused to fade. Locals spun stories of ghostly daughters drifting through the trees, of pale children glimpsed in twilight. Hunters claimed the woods carried no birdsong, that even nature recoiled from the soil. Teenagers dared each other to walk the old road, to stand where the barn once stood. Some swore they heard crying beneath their feet, as though the land itself remembered the infants buried there. Others said they felt watched, as though eyes long shut still lingered in the shadows. And so, the Blackwoods transformed from a sealed case file into folklore, a legend as much haunted by silence as by fact. The bloodline question, but legends only grow stronger when they hold a sliver of truth, and the truth is this. Not all of the Blackwood descendants perished in 1946. Many were absorbed into state systems, foster homes, or institutions. Some survived into adulthood, carrying their lineage with them into the wider world. Genealogists have speculated that Blackwood blood may still run quietly through Appalachia, hidden behind changed names and erased pasts. Are there families today, generations removed, who have no idea their ancestors came from the farmhouse on the ridge? Almost certainly, this possibility of a cursed bloodline scattered like seeds feeds the myth. For some, the Blackwoods are no longer confined to a single place. They are everywhere and nowhere, ghosts in the family tree. Lessons in silence. At its core, the Blackwood case is not just a tale of one man's depravity. It is a story of silence. For over 50 years, neighbors ignored the signs, doctors folded their hands, officials looked away, and when the truth finally surfaced, it was buried again under sealed files and whispered rumors. The Blackwoods show us what happens when shame outweighs courage, when communities decide that silence is easier than confrontation. Their story is less about horror in the hills and more about the consequences of looking away. Closing thoughts today. The Blackwoods are remembered in fragments, whispers, myths, half-buried files. But the questions they raise are timeless. How far does responsibility extend? What do we owe to those whose cries we hear but choose not to acknowledge? And perhaps most haunting, what horrors, hidden in silence today, will future generations look back on and ask how did they allow it to continue? And so I'll leave you with this. If the Blackwood farmhouse still stood, would you step inside? Would you face the silence that kept generations captive, or would you, like so many before, look away and walk past? Comment your answer below. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.